Hello everyone, and welcome to the IWM's monthly lecture. I am the rector of the IWM, Misha, Glenny, but I have to say, rather sadly, this is my last monthly lecture as I finish my tenure as IWM rector on the 31st of March. But what a monthly lecture to finish with. Michael Stewart, who I've known for almost 50 years, unbelievably. He's a professor of anthropology at University College London, but is also a renowned filmmaker. And I had to, unbelievably, Michael speaks Romany, Romanian, Hungarian, German and French, along with his native language, English. But he has been working for a long time on the fate of the Roma population in Europe during the Nazi period. And he'll be talking about that this evening in a quite a detailed fashion. He will be producing a book about what happened to the Roma population in Europe during the Nazi period, there has been no comprehensive assessment of this up until now. So, Michael, if you'd like to take the stage, let's hear your lecture.
Thank you, Misha. And I'd like to thank the IWM for having me here for 3 months as a fellow. It's been most productive time so far. I should also say that in this lecture I'm going to talk variously about Romany peoples in the plural, in line with the practice of Romany activists today, acknowledging the diversity of Romany lives and groups in Europe. I'm also, because I'm talking about the 1930s, going to use the language of that time. It would be inappropriate to think of Nazis talking about Roma much of the time. So I will talk about, in English, gypsies and in German, Zigeuner. Obviously, those are words in quote marks. But I will also talk about the Romany peoples in plural, and in particular the Roma populations who came west in Europe in the late 19th century, and the German-associated Sinti populations, also in France known as Manouche, who speak a Western dialect of Romany. So there'll be a diversity of terms. The French-born anthropologist Loïc Wacon, who won his ethnographic spurs fighting in the professional boxing rings of Southside Chicago, and so knows that of which he speaks, has recently described race as the single most troublesome and volatile category in the social sciences. It is, to quote another anthropologist, Zora Neale Hurston, like fire on the tongues of men, leaping on a whirlwind of social science discourse across social orders, often without enough regard for the particularities of time and place. Race all the time, race everywhere. Race, you might say, thinking of the focus of tonight's talk, über alles. So, to appear before you today to try and persuade you that in the very font where modern scientific racism was christened, in Nazi Germany, that a racial anthropology of mankind mattered less than we have come to believe, that the fire on the tongues of the National Socialist preachers was sparked less by genetics and evolutionary thinking than from more familiar ideas of the organic national community, the Volksgemeinschaft, and ways of fitting in, is perhaps controversial. But hell, what's the point of these safe spaces of the academy like this if we can't try to reimagine what it was 100 years ago that drove people to the murder of folk like the Romany peoples and the Jews? I've chosen the picture you can see here to begin this lecture because it and the series to which it belongs have come to illustrate the conventional answer as to what motivated and enabled the genocide of the Romany peoples. That is scientific racism. It shows an anthologist measuring the skull of a Romany Sinti woman. This, it is said, is what turned a historic hostility to this minority into murderous policy. I'll come back later to why these images are so misleading, but let me first say a few words as to why my argument is not a simple one to make. After the end of World War II, Romany victims of the Nazis campaigned for years, many of them fruitlessly to the end of their lives, for proper acknowledgement of their suffering and for monetary compensation for all they had lost. Let me sketch in just one case, that of Bernhard Reinhardt, a German Sinto who fought in the Wehrmacht, was expelled in early 1943, being of gypsy descent. Sent to join his wife and children in Auschwitz, he went on to Sachsenhausen, then Ravensbrück, where, like several hundred other Romany men, he was given the option of being sterilized and allowed to leave the camp directly into an SS-controlled Sonderkommando, the Dirlewanka. Thanks to a foot wound he suffered soon after his conscription, he survived the war. His application for compensation took a full 17 years, with his local authority, Kassel, at first insisting that he'd been sent to Auschwitz as an asocial, as an ordinary criminal, that is, and so not eligible for a pension. If you look at the image here, you can see how, by reproducing the Nazis' justification for incarceration, even bodies like the International Tracing Service trapped Romany victims. Here, this man is listed as arbeitsscheu, work shy, listed alongside the Zig, for Zigeuner, ethnonym. At one stage in his battle for recognition, two specialists examined my case, Mr. Reinhardt, a Professor Dr. Willinger, accompanied by Professor Dr. Sophie Erhardt, respectively, one of the higher-ranking medics involved in the secret T4 euthanasia murders of over 100,000 mental patients in hospitals after 1939, and she later learned to have herself selected Romany people in the 1940s, either for sterilization or for Auschwitz. They concluded, perhaps unsurprisingly, that Reinhardt today displayed no morbid perturbations or psychoneurological impairments, so no grounds for compensation. Yet later on, Kassel, the town hall, suggested that poor Mr. Reinhardt must be suffering from a pension neurosis. And were he now to receive payments, these would only serve to tie him to the past, reminding him each month of his original trauma. Only a change to the compensation law in 1965 that allowed many disputed Romany cases to be referred back to the courts by including Romany people as victims of racial persecution let him finally win his case. After 1945, few officials dared to suggest to Jewish applicants for compensation that it was their membership of a parasitic community that had tried to achieve world domination that was the reason for their persecution. Romany applicants did not benefit from such restraint. From the end of the 1940s, people like Reinhardt were told that the measures taken against them were their own fault. It was the gypsies' character type, their antisocial behavior, their crime and wandering drive that were the root of their problems. It is hardly surprising, then, that the emphasis of Romany civil mobilization since has been to insist on the racial character of the persecution and thereby to suggest a precise parallel with the torments of the Jews. Now, at the same time as these campaigns for recognition were being waged, in a separate academic history, explanations of the dynamics of the Third Reich have also developed. A focus on the dictatorship and the totalitarian nature of rule dominated at first. The ordinary population was presented as terrorized into obedience. If race was mentioned in these early works, it was as a credo reserved for the ideologues, for the Himmlers and the SS. Gradually, a new generation of scholars began to discuss the scripts and idioms of persecution. They also attended to a far wider range of victims, Romany ones included. The 1990 book, The Racial State, by Wolfgang Wippermann and Michael Burley, brought this work together. It focused on the role of racial anthropology and stressed the post-Darwinian roots of racist ideologies. The key argument was that the racial and non-class space of Nazi rule differentiated it from all other modern totalitarianisms. An important implication was that far wider elites were involved in the development of Nazi social policies than just Himmler and his acolytes. The culmination of this approach, infused with a new interest in the rituals and habits of everyday life, was reached by Harvard professor Peter Fritscher's magnificently succinct and comprehensive Life and Death in the Third Reich from 2008. Fritscher adopted the metaphor of grooming to capture the way in which nearly all ordinary Germans were seduced into new racial ways of evaluating their own behavior, their social relations and their social standing. His approach is enormously helpful in understanding how, for example, the rule-bound Weimar policeman of 1928 becomes a willing, racially groomed organizer of the concentration camp internments of the Arbeitsscheu, of the Workschei, in 1938, or the mass deportations of Romany people to the east as early as May 1940. But Fritscher also exaggerates. It's quite true, as he said, that for the Nazis, biology was the key to the destiny of the German people. But what did this mean in practice? As we shall see, a Pankov rations officer in 1942 remains quite confused when asked to calculate his citizens or compute his citizens racially. The claim that Nazism offered a completely new understanding of human existence, rearranging what was necessary and possible, what was enduring and ephemeral, what was virtuous and dangerous, is overblown. For a start, the social burdens that the Nazis targeted were identical to those that Weimar society felt it suffered from. The transgenerational poor, those incapable of looking after themselves, the physically disabled, the cretins, the hard-to-identify and mobile populations, sexual minorities like homosexual men, the ethnically other, and so on. The completely new understanding of human existence, posited by Fritscher, had failed to identify any new finder or enemies. The old finder were now described in a biologically inflected language that did, to quote Fritscher, recast politics in an exceptionally vivid way. But to think that ordinary citizens and countless civil servants raised in imperial and Weimar cultures of public service just shed their civic skins for new racial ones in the 6 years before the war is to fall for the self-aggrandizing, revolutionary self-image of National Socialism. Yes, going through the ritual of creating an Ahnenpass, a proof of German ancestry, did cultivate a new attention to and anxiety about genealogical purity. But as we shall see with the Romany peoples, old ways of thinking about and categorizing otherness remained impressively resilient. Before I turn back to consider the motivations and modus operandi of those who were centrally involved in the persecution of various Romany groups, there is one more question to raise about the theoretical language we use. This concerns the category of race as a marker of human difference. It's a folk notion, and unlike many other popular categories, has no analytic equivalent in social science discourse. It is quite different from, say, categories like gender or class, which refer to phenomena that exist out there in the real world, independent of their categorization. Human sexual difference and the occupation division of labor, respectively, in those cases. race has no referent except for the imaginary entities posited by racist thinking or by racist persons. There are perhaps 20 to 30,000 human lineages that will be of interest to geneticists of the future. But outside of that context, there are no biologically significant races in the human species. But hold it, you might say. You're entirely missing the power of racializing language and attitudes. No question. Labeling others racially diminishes, belittles, and demeans their efforts to lead their own lives in their own terms. It metaphorically evokes an idea that differences in the behavior from the speakers are biologically inherited. The issue arises, I think, from the way in which talk of ethnic groups retains the necessary ambivalence over the relative importance of shared descent and shared cultural practice. Ethnic groups, as Weber described them, entertain a subjective belief in their common descent because of similarities of physical type, or customs, or both. It is possible to talk about the stability of ethnic cultures with what we might call a sliding scale of racialization. At one end of the scale, we talk of the influence of upbringing and social environment, while at the other, we evoke immutable, biological trait-like inheritance. All of us, all humans, are capable of metaphorically applying what we know about other animal species to human groups, naturalizing and essentializing cultural behaviors. Dress and gait stand in just fine for animal morphology, and character can be talked of as if it was the expression of the essential nature of another species. When Xerxes the Great had sculptures of all the peoples he ruled over and all his soldiers lined up along the Persepolis staircase, with their distinctive features of body and dress lovingly etched in stone, he too was creating ethno-racial categories of people. One more thing flows from talking of others as belonging to a race, from making the absurd claim that cultural learnt behaviors are as immutably inherited as the color of our eyes. The reference back to biology and reproduction allows, indeed perhaps insists, on ideas of purification. Just as a farmer will castrate all the tups, the male sheep, who don't display the features he requires in his next generation of sheep, so human populations can be reshaped by biological purification, elimination. Now, for any racial policy to be imposed, the questions of who is an X and who is a Y must always be answered. And they cannot be answered in the language of race, since that language names no fixed entities. This is a point that the American anthropologist Charles Wagley, who worked in Latin America, made in a wonderful paper written nearly 70 years ago on the concept of social race in the Americas. He adopts this term, social race, because the groups he discusses are socially, not biologically defined. Folk terms like Negro, white, Indian, or mestizo, or mulatto, do not have genetic meanings, and may, in one society, be classifications based on real or imaginary physical characteristics, while in another, they may refer more to criteria of social status, such as education, wealth, language, and even custom, while in still another, they may indicate near or distant ancestry. As Wagley goes on to say, the criteria for allocation to social races differ considerably from region to region, and the way people are classified into such social race tells us, in itself, much about the relations between such groups. So, how did the German Nazi administration allocate people to the race of the Zigeuner? In relation to the social race of Jewish citizens, there were the community lists of synagogue attendees, as well as deep historical baptismal records of conversions. So that although there was no racial test of Jewishness, merely the religious affiliation of parents and grandparents, it was easy to think that one was dealing with a clearly demarcated ethno-racial group. Nothing of the sort existed for Romany persons who were Christians and had previously been distinguished along non-racial lines as domestic or foreign gypsies and sedentary or itinerant gypsies by the authorities. The story of how these questions were answered, which is to say, how the so-called gypsy question was recomposed in the years 1935 to 1940, is most simply told through the career of a strange, neurotic figure, a medically trained child psychologist, and a keen believer in the adoption of extensive eugenic measures across society. Robert Ritter. While a genuinely third-rate academic, Ritter had a sort of instinctive ambition, an utterly mercenary willingness to frame and reshape his work in the form that his political superiors needed at any particular moment. His genius, if that it can be called, was, at just the right moment in 1935, to reconfigure his long-standing research on some roving rascal youths, the children of German travellers, or Jenisch, that is to say, an indigenous German population with a history rather like that of the Irish travellers in the British Isles, to reframe that as a contribution to the resolution of the gypsy question. He accomplished this by saying that these Jenisch had long intermarried with German Sinti families, German Romany families. And so his study of these people would allow him to address the problem of mixed-race gypsy families. It's fair to say that while there was a lot of research exploring the role of heredity in so-called asocial and criminal families, there was no one who could claim population-level data on Romany families. Ritter had identified a gap in the market. The enormous chart illustrated here, and its annotation system in the slide I'll open up in a second, purportedly represented the hereditarian impact of various burdens carried in this population. This chart had some 900 individuals listed on it, most of which were marked with a little circle in which the different grades of the hereditary burdens they supposedly carried were marked in by filling in leaving white or grey or black, depending on the intensity of the belasting of the burden for all these people, as if the chart itself provided proof of the inheritance of these burdens. Ritter's approach to defining the population he's dealing with here is revealing. He acknowledged that he knew nothing about the origin of most of the families in his sample, though in the present, some were identified as Jenisch travellers and others identified as Zigeuner by the police and local authorities. So instead, he floated a kite. Many of this sample had vagrant, the word vagrant, marked on their records during the 19th century when they got married or when they were christened. The parents might be Mr. Faust, vagrant. The numbers in the sample were such that a reasonable explanation could be, or so Ritter argued, that this rabble's wandering instinct was stronger than that of many other itinerant people, itinerant tradespeople. And so Ritter asked, was it not an element of gypsy blood that prevented these families from truly settling down? Would it not make sense to assume that here we are dealing with mixed-race people? Aware that the word vagrant on a marriage certificate dated 1850 was perhaps insubstantial evidence of race, Ritter went on to insist that there was other corroborative evidence. First of all, people's appearance. Many in this sample were described as swarthy, dark, or having black hair or black eyes. These very words were also, Ritter said, used for people who appeared in the christening or other records listed officially as Zigeuner, as gypsies. Surely this was evidence of intermarriage. Ritter had a bit of a problem here, because many members of the largest family in this chart, people he was recording, the Fausses, the Faust, by the name of Faust, the family name, they were German citizens and Romany-speaking people. But they had overwhelmingly red and not black hair. No matter, Ritter said. And just as you'd expect from Charles Wagley's wise comments I cited earlier on, Ritter here noted that one can, quote, with a certain degree of justification, infer racial affiliation from professions. Having an ancestor listed as an executioner, a horse dealer, a herbalist, or musician, all suggested traces of Romany descent. And in the case of those who played the dulcimer, the zither, the flat-borded trapezoidal zither, well, he said, this was an instrument that was played amongst the crooks at that time only by the gypsies or their descendants. So the dulcimer, at least, provided a certain fixed reference when establishing the genetic line. But what made Ritter so fitting for this moment was his interest in the mixing of Romany and German families. In 1935, the Nazis did not have any explicitly formulated policy towards the Romany peoples. By arguing that the crux of the problem, and here Ritter used the new hereditarian language, lay among the gypsy mixed breeds, the Mischlinge, he framed things in a way that all Nazis could recognize. Scholars like Christopher Hutton and Richard Wetzel have described the constitutive incoherence of Nazi scientific debates about the nature of race. It was quite uncertain to them whether the Germans or Jews were races. And if they were, in fact, in each case, just a mixed folk, how could they truly embody the essential characteristic of a race, immutable racial characteristics? In this confusion, what all did agree on, including people like Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuur, the great German geneticist who went on to have a glorious career after the war as well, what they all did agree on was that the mixing of people from genetically distant populations was a source of genetic harm. By addressing the value or the worthlessness of racial mixing between gypsies and Germans, Ritter's work brought the so-called gypsy question into a manageable frame, a recognizable frame. Who these people were, what their racial characteristics were, no longer mattered in such detail. The issue was that these alien folk should not interbreed with our folk. Within weeks of his lecture, Ritter had received significant central research funds to develop the state's racial hygiene measures for these mostly asocial bastards who, i.e. Mischling, who are semi-sedentary German citizens who cannot simply be deported across a border. Quoting Ritter now. His reputation rose fast, and by April 1936, a bit more than a year later, he was asked to found a high-level racial hygiene and population biology research institute. Henceforth, I'll use its German acronym of the RHF. An institute that would straddle the two ministries of health and the interior, working in a more or less direct line to Heinrich Himmler. In effect, Ritter took on the job that Werner Best, the leading theoretician of the Nazi police state, was at that moment devising, to reshape the police as the people's doctor. 2 years later, in 1938, the Ministry of the Interior issued a new Gypsy decree, which stated that Nazi policy would henceforth be aligned with the inner characteristics of the race. Ritter would be on hand to explain just what constituted the racial character of these people. That is to say, to isolate certain hereditary capacities, something innate and unchangeable in this population. Of course, even though Ritter believed that there were hardly any pure race gypsies in Germany, less than 10% he asserted, to define a mixed population, he would have to demonstrate the presence of a distinct gypsy substrate, gypsy genetic substrate, or an Erbanlage. This was needed to constitute one part of the Mischling phenomenon. How to proceed? Ritter, a child psychologist by training, albeit of a hereditarian bent, was completely out of his depth. One approach he essayed from 1936 on used racial anthropology tools, aiming to find hereditary physical characteristics that were unique to the Romany people, traits that would mark their owner out as indisputably a member of this and not that race. Thanks to promising work on regional differences in blood serology that had been carried out in Poland, blood samples were also collected, and so on, as illustrated in these pictures. Here, a woman's having a facial mask taken, and there are the masks on the left-hand side, photographed at the time, kept in the offices of the RHF, almost certainly to frighten and terrify people who were brought in there, not for any other purpose. Ritter was well aware that this sort of approach would look properly scientific, and so he ensured that all this work was meticulously documented. The lack of any serious scientific commitment, however, was totally remarkable. With one partial exception, a late paper by Sophie Earhart on hand ridge patterns and criminal biology, not a single article, not a single finding was ever published from this work. Nothing on Romany cephalic indices, head shapes, nothing on Romany health, and nothing on blood serology made it to press, not even to lecture. The work undertaken by the RHF that did matter was that done hand in hand with the police, identifying Romany families and establishing their genealogies. There was amongst the German authorities at that time a greatly exaggerated belief that Romany persons were systematically using false identities and papers to subvert the police's work. Ritter therefore sent his staff out on short-term field trips to fill in elaborate forms, mostly multiple-choice questionnaires, eliciting demographic and behavioral data from the Sinti, from the German Romany people. The questionnaires began with information on type of dwelling, how well the home was maintained, possessions allegedly owned. The researchers were also asked to identify what type of person they were dealing with. The criterion of type was, of course, slippery, as moral evaluations of style of life here become apparent. Were they racial, rassig, i.e. pure, or mixed, gemischt, wandering, semi-sedentary, sedentary, villagers, city dwellers? Now, Ritter had already gone public in the summer of 1937 with a clear statement that, amongst us, in Germany, we do not have any sedentary gypsies, only mixed-race sedentaries. So, since theory stated that the Zigeuner were racially nomadic, a person settled in a city, suspected to be of Romany descent, could only be a Mischling, mixed breed. Let me show you a chart to illustrate the actual way of working of the RHF rather than racial theory. One of scores of genealogical tables produced by the RHF in the late 1930s and early 40s. This reproduces the sleights of hand Ritter had used in his vast 1935 chart I showed you. The table here purports to demonstrate the degree to which different individuals in this family can be said to have gypsy genetic material. It appears to present a family starting in the 1860s with two individuals, Jakob Reinhardt and Marie Anna, who are marked, as you can see in the circles, as quarter gypsies. Their children either married non-Z, not gypsies, not Zigeuner, or mixed blood Zigeuner. And so they in turn produce a generation on the bottom line, born in the 1920s, who were classified as of predominantly German blood, but still Zs. To use the terminology of the time, and I'll show you a chart shortly, ZM minus, Zigeuner Mischlinge of a lower grade. But the chart represents a piece of trickery. The flow is not from past to present, top to bottom, but vice versa. In reality, the researchers start by meeting members of the younger or intermediate generation, who are still alive. They identify them as mixed race from their behavior, where they're living, the language they're using with each other. They hear the firm assertions of some of the parents that they themselves are not Romany, NZ. I'm not of Romany descent, they say, and put that on the chart. And they project back into the 1860s the notion that the grandparents were quarter gypsies. They cannot possibly know this, and they present no evidence for it. The reason they do so is made clear when we look at this chart of the degrees of Mischlinghood produced by the RHF. As illustrated in line 32 of the chart, at the bottom, having two quarter Z grandparents is the minimum for the descendants still to come under measures for those to be treated according to the nature of that race. It's striking, of course, that this racial metric is so much more severe than in the case of the Jewish Mischling. Social races are constituted in different ways, as Wagley noted. And also, actually, this is much less severe than the United States one-drop Jim Crow policies, which had two more degrees of genealogy, and 1/64th of your ancestors made you black. Think back to the idea of social race to explain that. But for now, let me go back for a moment to this question of how the RHF staff determined that the intermediate and young generation were part gypsy, and so start the process of projection back into the past, because having established that two of the grandparents were quarter gypsies, all the people in that chart counted as coming under the 1938 racial decree. All kinds of behavioral markers helped the RHF researchers to decide, as Ritter confessed in a 1939 paper. Since he said you could not determine a Romany person by their shape or appearance, he said we're forced to look for further criteria that would distinguish them. In fact, he said, it is often precisely their manner of presenting themselves, their movement, their gait, the way they stand, their gestures and facial expressions, and also their mentality, that testify that we are dealing with gypsies. At other times, he insisted that it was speaking Romany as a mother tongue that was the truest marker of racial belonging. Just how far the RHF moved away from the language of racial anthropology comes over in their approach to uncertainties over the paperwork underpinning identity. As I've said, there was a concern amongst the police that thousands, I'm quoting here, thousands of foreign gypsies had falsely acquired German names and thus citizenship, in the sense of Staatsangehörigkeit. Additionally, the constant change of names in these families had been common practice for generations, such that, quote, there are hundreds of families in which each member, including many siblings, have a different surname, and instead of the same parents, had different parents listed on their papers. The point is that when a person already under suspicion then produced confusing paperwork, this was immediate grounds to suspect Romany ancestry. I have just last week been reading the file of a Helena Klebic, aged nearly 70, and held in a Berlin police cell in 1941, though she was very ill at the time. Klebic was both a German citizen and had a German father. Two of the RHF workers, Eva Justin, who you saw on the first slide, and a Frau Winkler, were convinced, however, that her inability to provide satisfactory documents proving her father's family, marked her out as a typical gypsy, and that therefore her German citizenship through her father was falsely acquired. The Berlin police, in this case, not known for their sympathy or tolerance of Romany families, were quite happy with the paperwork presented. They wanted to send Klebic home to die. But Ritter's workers insisted she be put in a concentration camp in order to terrify the rest of the family to confessing their true race. So convinced were the RHF that they were dealing with a Michelin family because of the dodgy paperwork in the ancestral files. Now, to bring this talk to a conclusion, back in the early 1990s, the idea of Nazi Germany as a racial state seemed to offer a much more specific way to grasp the dynamics of that regime. It would be absurd now to claim that race was not of paramount significance to the Nazis. As some in this room may know well, in the Burgenland, for example, the leading Austrian Nazi, Tobias Porci, articulated and implemented an approach that used a far clearer racial language to dramatic effect than in Germany. And if you look now at the last slide, which is probably too small for you to read, it shows a request from the mayor's office of Pankow in Berlin, asking the police office for gypsy affairs, the central office, what the significance for food ration allocations is of somebody being declared 75% German-blooded, so like the grandparents in the previous chart. Labels of blood and therefore race are clearly being used in government activity, even if the official involved cannot quite work out what they entail. He wants to know, can these people be fed like other Germans? The letter asks whether a Zigeuner of 75% German blood can get a German level of blood ration or not. Unfortunately, we don't have the central office's answer. But precisely because race is a signifier without a signified, a term that can float free of any fixed reference, the racism of Nazi policy could take completely unscientific forms. When Robert Ritter imagines that pure gypsies, and this is what marks them out, they have an immutable Wandertrieb, an immutable drive to wander, rippling through their bodies. I think he's engaging in the same sort of mystical, contagionist idea of race, racial essence, as the Nuremberg law clause that forbade the remarriage of a German woman, of a German female party member, if she had been previously, remarriage to a German of a German female party member, if she had been previously married to a Jew. Her sexual activity with a Jew had mystically polluted her reproductive organs. So whereas some, like my colleague, the British historian Dan Stone, have tried to distinguish scientific from mystical race thinking, I'm suggesting here there is never race without a mystical belief in peculiar genetic forces and entities. Erbanlager, to use the language of the time. After Julius Streicher was arrested in 1945 and was being interrogated by American soldiers, he was teased that for all his talk of blonde hair and the importance of racial purity, the Führer hardly fitted his model. Streicher responded at once, well, he wasn't a pure Nordic, about 80%. Race, he said, is also expressed in character. Another way of putting this is to say that racial thinking is not fundamentally different from folkish thinking, from thinking associated with the German idea of the folk. If we look for the idiom by which the Nazis defined the National Socialist state, it was, after all, as a Volksgemeinschaft, in that old sense from Tönnies, the sociologist, not a society or a Gesellschaft, but a community, a Gemeinschaft, and one inflected with the semi-mystical idea of the folk as an organic national body, with its Volkskörper, a natural community of blood. Romany and Jewish people could not fit into a German Volksgemeinschaft, and so their presence was to be eliminated. As Brigitte Hamann shows in her wonderful book, Hitler's Vienna, when Hitler finally adopted a politically anti-Semitic stance at the end of World War I, it was the Jew as world dominator, as the leader of the Jewish revolutions embodied respectively in Bolshevism and Wall Street, that he conjured up. It was imagined Jewish behavior that was identified as threatening the ability of the German people to realize itself. Cultural characteristics represented as emergent from immutable and hereditary dispositions. And in a very similar fashion, Romany persons were excluded from the Volksgemeinschaft because they were ungeartet, ill-formed types. They couldn't become angepassten, couldn't fit into the social order. A defining feature of the new man that the Volksgemeinschaft was creating was that he would contribute to the nation's greatness through strong, efficient, and self-sacrificing performance in his work, through Leistung. The stereotypical Romany family, traveling around the country selling small goods and playing music in the taverns, could never be assimilated to the efficient and productive toilers who took joy in their work, who experienced Arbeitsfreude. Neither Jew nor Romany person could understand Gemeinnutz geht vor Eigennutz. Common good comes before personal benefit. In every German town through the 1930s, we see the effects of this new Weltanschauung, this new way of looking at the world, followed through with greater or weaker fervour, as local authorities moved to restrict or entirely forbid the issuing of travelling salesman permits to Sinti and Roma to bring an end to their parasitical life world. Wilhelm Laubinger, aged 29 in Magdeburg, had lived from selling violins until 1938. He had never himself, nor had other members of his family, received unemployment benefit or welfare. But in June 1938, as part of Action Workschei, Reich Action Workschei, he was flung into Sachsenhausen as Workschei because, as he himself told the police, "I have no desire for a fixed and regulated workplace. I prefer trading." In the Q&A, we can perhaps discuss the ways that issues of mobility were similarly configured as alien and alienating. Why does all this matter? Trying to grasp the logic of the persecution of Romany peoples, it is a mistake, I think, to think that a single overarching theory derived from Nazi racial thought drove it forward. This was a persecution and genocide pushed in large part from the bottom up. It was police officers and their bosses, mayors and town hall bureaucrats who insisted that in a Volksgemeinschaft, where finally one could feel unter uns, this sort of thing, these sorts of people, had no place. But they struggled to find a single frame within which to pursue their goal, to rid Germany of its Romany peoples. Throughout Nazi rule, different models or systems for thinking about these people persisted. I've talked about one of these today. Racial categories were adopted, as in the Michelin charts, but for instance, the set of personal documents where the question arises over rations and blood ratios is actually mostly concerned, scores of pages, legalistically, with whether Mrs. Klebitsch and her family are German citizens, have Staatsangehörigkeit, not Reichsbürger, and entitled or not to a travelling salesman's license. Questions framed in social, not racial terms. And it's also clear that this welfare officer who wrote the note has not assimilated the racial model embodied in Ritter's chart that I showed earlier. He wouldn't be asking the question if he had, because that lot, 75% German blood, are going to infect their grandchildren, let alone themselves. Retaining a sense of this complexity and refusing to allow the simplifying logic imposed by the courts, the compensation courts, where only political, racial, or religious persecution counted, is the only way, I think, to stay true to the ways in which Romani and Jewish persecutions took place in the Nazi people's community. It is also necessary to understand why it was that the Jews were persecuted as individuals, while it was as families, as Sippe, that Romani persons found themselves targeted, though that's a story for another day. The social races of Jews and Romani people were variously constituted, but their fate was, to use my colleague Ari Joskowitz's felicitous phrase, entangled. The focus on the organically conceived national community, the Volksgemeinschaft, is also, I suggest, a way to make sense of what happened to men like Bernhard Reinhardt and other survivors. Racial criteria and language were largely abandoned by the German state after 1945. But the same sort of thinking about Romani persons persisted. If notions of national community and forms of belonging to the ethnically conceived nation were more central to the persecutions of the Nazis than we have thought, then it is likely that the continuities between those times and ours are stronger than we sometimes like to imagine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. Oh, yes, thank you very much, Michael. I want to start by putting things into context, largely because there is a great deal of popular knowledge about the Jewish Holocaust. There is very little knowledge about what happened to the Roma here in Austria and in Germany and other occupied territories. So can you start by giving us a sort of overall understanding of the extent of the Roma Holocaust?
As Misha said at the beginning, there is not yet a comprehensive survey of the persecution of Romani peoples across the whole of Europe. And of course, on the Eastern Front, where large numbers of Romani people were killed as part of partisan groups or living in the forests, it will probably never become possible to know exactly how many died. But if we just take Austria as one extreme, in the Burgenland, something like 97% of the Romani population died. About 150 people came back after the war. There's just the extraordinary book, Einfach Weg, just go, get lost, by Gerhard Baumgartner and Professor Brettel, listing the settlements in the Burgenland, with the old 1930s drawings of where they were, and the list of people who disappeared, demonstrates the extraordinary extent to which in that part of Austria the Romani presence was eliminated. Elsewhere, in Hungary, far lower numbers. Romania, all the auffällig, the gypsies who come to attention, either because they're on the road or they're causing trouble in one way or another, get deported to Transnistria. Somewhere, my estimate is around 200,000 people died. High estimates are 500,000, low estimates 120,000. In Germany, the vast majority of those German Romany people who were still alive in 1943 were sent to Auschwitz, where at the end, in August 1944, Hearst, the commandant, killed almost all of them. Those who were still able to work were sent on to Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück and so on. So it's a continental-wide persecution, including internments in France, deportations of French Romany people along the west bank of the Rhine from the area around Lille, the German-occupied areas in the north.
And the second question I have is that you say that it was a bottom-up persecution, but that doesn't apply to the persecution of the Jews.
Indeed.
Because, we have everything from Wannsee, onwards, and we have Kristallnacht and so on and so forth. So are you arguing that in the absence of that bottom-up surge, as it were, against the Romany peoples, that they could have escaped their fate?
No, I mean,
was there any drive from the centre?
Yes, there was drive from the centre. I mean, there was an awareness of the issue, and indeed not just an awareness. There was an intense interest in the issue. Before the end of September 1939, on the first order when Eichmann held a conference of all the Einsatzgruppe leaders at that time, he issues a statement saying all the Jews and 30,000 Zigeuner to the east. That's September 1939. People are thinking about these issues, and indeed in May 1940, 2,500 Romany people from the Rhine Valley were deported to Poland in a move a bit like the Nisko deportations, chaotically, not thought through, but there was a clear idea that in the future there was a clear idea amongst some of the Nazis that in the future there will be no Romany peoples left in Germany. That changed somewhat in the 1940s in complicated ways that would probably be too long to go into here. But despite that, they never passed a law. There's no clearly articulated policy apart from that issued by the Racial Hygiene Research Institute. And there's enormous variation in what happens from town to town. In a small village where a family has been staying in winters for 30 years or more and is known to the locals, if they have good relations, people will protect them and try and stop them from being taken away. If historically in that place, so in Magdeburg, for instance, in the Action Workshai, all the men on June the 18th, 1938, all the gypsy men in the town, of whom the police know, they don't know of all of them, they're taken away. They're brought in for interrogation, and the vast majority are sent to concentration camps as Workshai. The forms say Arbeitsscheu Zigeuner, or sometimes they just say Zigeuner. Reason for incarceration: gypsy, because gypsies are by definition Workshai. In Köln, far fewer people. In Berlin, far fewer people are taken in that. They don't try and arrest everybody. So there's significant variation. The party is much less involved. The Gestapo is not involved at all. It's entirely crucial difference. It's the criminal police who are the central to the whole persecution, because they're the people who used to deal with Romany trouble, the Zigeunerplage, and it's from them that you get the articulation of what could be done.
Thanks. That is fundamentally different.
It's fundamentally different in the sense that's one of the reasons. I mean, I personally live with Romany people in Hungary in the 1980s who had and the family I knew, well, some of them had been deported, but the people, particularly people I lived with, had been saved by the arrival of the Russian army over the hill at Gyöngyös, because the Germans were moving up, taking Romany families away at that time in 1944. So I've been aware of this for years and years. But as an academic, the interesting thing is studying a genocide that doesn't have a Mein Kampf, that doesn't have people banging on in the newspapers all the time. Hitler famously only mentions Romany people twice in all his after-dinner speeches. He's not engaged. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of German Zigeuner are deported to Auschwitz. So it's how this happens without a central plan. A town hall genocide, you might call it.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Kirst.
Thank you, Michael. I want to know why there has been so little scholarship on this.
I mean, it's an awful thing to say, but I don't know what, like, I'm not German. I think in Eastern Europe, it's not an obvious career move as an anthropologist or historian to decide you're going to write about Romany people. In fact, it's kind of suicidal, I'd have thought, for a 25-year-old. If you're ambitious, other people are just going to think it's just, why are you bothered with that? And that's partly about, xenophobia, racist attitudes, whatever. In Germany, I mean, there was a great German historian, Micha Zimmermann, who in the 1980s began to work on this. He worked on persecution of trade unionists first, and then moved sideways with the growing interest in sort of everyday life and what it really meant to think like a Nazi. He died young. The people who have worked on it have written in a heavily academic, published their theses, basically. Nobody has yet in Germany really produced a popular work. The other thing to say is that, and what makes my work possible, is there are now, two things make it possible. One is there are about 40 local studies from different German towns, and which allow you to track the differences from Göttingen to Kassel to Bremerhaven to Berlin to Munich and so on. So local work by local historians. And the other thing that makes it possible, which is completely different, is that when I started this work, historic 25 years ago, I have done some other things meanwhile, I should say, but the people I was researching, as you saw in those pictures there, you probably may not be able to read it, people born in the 1920s, they were still subject to anonymization. And so I couldn't see that, unless I spent weeks writing out the names of every individual, I couldn't track individuals or families in the archive because they were all blacked out. Now, 100-year rule, actually DDR, ex-DDR, it can be 110, but mostly 100-year rule, I can have the files with no name. And since the persecution was all done by family, you need to be able to trace the movement of families through the system. So in terms of Germany, it totally, the move out of anonymization. I think also it's a puzzle for people. And there isn't, without a text, without newspapers, without a lot of newspapers denouncing, without obvious cases of that sort, it is a bit of a challenge, I think.
Yes, first and then 1, 2, and Aisha, your third.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. In the end, you talked about the continuities to the present. I was wondering about the continuities between how such stereotypes accumulated in order to make such notions as Arbeitsscheu even credible. The fact that it wasn't the Nazis that invented that, but it was something that was circulated a long time before, was tied to notions of vagrancy that were not just particular to the Roma, but was tied to the Roma because the idea that they were all a nomadic people, which is not the case, was kind of narrowed down to being only about the Roma. So how much of this semantic accumulation played a role in becoming, or can you say anything about it, played a role in this bottom-up mobilization, as you call it? Would it be, aren't they mutually reinforcing, I think, is what I'm saying, because the ressentiment was there, right? Do you make it state policy, or do you dwell on everyday negative stereotypes that feed into the kind of racialized imagery that the state is producing anyway? So you're just pointing to this other that has maybe been left out, but is actually all the material is there to other them as well. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I completely, but let me try and give an answer about the accumulation of imagery and stereotypes over time. So the German police, of course, Germany didn't exist in the 18th century, but the origins of the German police lie in lists created by a remarkable officer of law and order, George Scheffer, in the late 18th century, who created what he called the Goinerliste. So lists of Goiner, lists of vagrants and rogues. Hard to identify because they're on the move, people without a home, without a Heimat, a masterless rabble of men, a herrenloses Gesindel, in which one of their questions was not particularly important in the 18th century, but one issue they sometimes noted was whether people were Zigeuner or not. Not always. Indeed, at that time, what made these people noticeable was that they moved around, sometimes that they spoke a different language, and that they didn't have masters. And they didn't do regular work in the way that settled landless people in a village would do. They might well be employed on and off, but not all the time, not regularly. And so these people were distinct. And and those lists form the basis of the development of. They get printed up, sent around to the various, especially Southwest German principalities and states. The vast number of them that existed then, in order to track people who are crossing borders as part of their normal way of life, but from the police's point of view, crossing borders to evade our supervision. And so in that process, through the 19th century, many of the official stereotypes begin to be built up. And linked, as you say, to broader discourses around what makes a proper person in the new nation, their labour, the fact that they are properly rooted in a particular place. And then, in the 1930s, those come back with a real force. There's a huge, the Action Arbeitsscheu, the majority of people taken were vagrant non-Romany people, vagrant in the looser sense, people who were unemployed on the road. And so, indeed, there were many beggar action days before that. The first one in early 1933, in which all kinds of people were taken off the road and punished in various ways for not behaving. So this accumulation of imagery is embedded in. And then partly, I think it's fair to say, because of the link between welfare and residency in Germany, unlike say in Britain, the authorities are much more aware of movement and does this person have any right to claim welfare in this particular community? And if they don't, and they're clearly indigent or in need of help, you move them on. Yeah, that was the traditional way of dealing with this. And so in some senses, there was a particularly German aspect to this, given the way welfare was set up.
Yeah, but that also presumably links up with German romantic nationalism and the nationalism that emerged in Germany, which is always identified with place and soil and blood and so on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that would have the two would have.
The two completely fuse.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, this said, of course, the poor victims of all this, Sinti Romani people, are wholly German. I mean, they speak German. They are Germans in every way, as well as being Romani. So I think for them, it was the most horrific shock in the 1930s. When, as it was, of course, for assimilated Jews, when suddenly the system gets turned around on them.
Yes, I would like to address the flip side of the first question, which was why is there so little research on this, which then implies there has been research on this. In which countries and where is it taking place? I would expect there would be a strong interest in the countries where there's significant Romani population, Slovakia, Hungary, the former Yugoslav republics, Romania, and such. Are there leading scholars in these countries that are conducting it? And are there any Romani scholars who are driving this, and do they write about this in their own language?
The answer to that is yes and yes and yes. There's a growing body of literature. The history of this is partly that, there were, in several countries, in the 1960s and 70s, there were people, perhaps no more in the 1970s and 80s, as Romani civic mobilization developed, especially in Germany, and people began to notice this. There was a sort of counter-movement. So a man called Laszlo Karsai in Hungary wrote a book saying really there was no real persecution of the Roma in Hungary. A very, very brilliant American historian, Gunter Louis, wrote a book called The Persecution of the Gypsies. Persecution, not genocide, deliberately. He went on to write a book about the Armenians in order to say the Jewish Holocaust was unique. And you can't make any sort of comparison. The book has the most brilliant archival research in it, but it's also a perverted piece of work in many ways. And of course the work is lost to people because most people won't read it because he's got this agenda. But there is a whole generation of younger people. There was a great French historian, Henri Daciot, who worked on Romani histories, who has had many, many young scholars, Mate Petre in Romania, and others all around. There's a Romani museum in outside Krakow, set up by Adam Bartosz, a Polish Rom whose family survived the war, and he has been documenting in Poland. There's an enormous amount of work among younger Romani people, and indeed on August the 8th, the anniversary of the liquidation of the Romani family camp in Auschwitz, there are now large gatherings of young Romani people and their supporters at Auschwitz. So there's stuff on Yugoslavia. Russia is almost untouched. But I have a large amount of Ukrainian archive myself. So the answer is yes, there is. And more than that, I think it's fair to say, I don't know if there are any Romani people in the audience, but it's fair to say that the genocide has become a key image through which a pan-European Romani identity and sense of shared destiny can come into being. Because it's this thing which, apart from with the exception of the Gitanos in Spain, all the Romani people in Europe suffered from it. So yes is the answer. I can give you a reading list.
Aisha.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this fascinating talk. I mean, if race is a floating empty signifier, it's I mean, of course, that there should not, I mean, you can't find scientific evidence for ascription. And I mean, it is all clear, but also in terms of that die Gemeinschaft, that, I mean, especially the Mischling becomes a danger, is, it's not open? Okay. It's not, okay. It of course becomes a very big danger in all of the racisms that we know, actually, and you define, you identify, I mean, you define by race, and then you find it through the morals, and then you identify with the practice. But my question is in terms of Arbeit, that which looms large in everywhere. Yeah. In what you're talking, it is Arbeitsschau, Schau.
Yeah.
Scheu, sorry, Arbeitsscheu. And in terms of, I mean, everywhere it is defined through labor, in a way. And I am wondering, I mean, it's a kind of a question, in terms of forced labor, how did they figure out? It is, I mean, in terms of the extermination, killings that we know. I mean, the one reason I'm asking is that I know I'm interested in, and I know a little bit on Hermann Göring's work. And if you look at it, you have Roma forced labor.
Yeah.
Like they have, and when you are saying that it is a bottom-up genocide, not from above, I am not so sure for certain things, because if you look at the regulations and then the allocation of rights in a perverse way, but there were, and the pays and in everything, because they used very different groups of people, and their two groups do not appear and almost appear in the same way. It is the Jews and the Gypsies in terms of their categorization and the official documents. Yeah. So there is, of course, yes, there's no Wannsee kind of thing for definitely, but how could we put that? And I am curious about that kind of really the research, and then if the labor looms so much, and what happens in terms of labor and in terms of the forced labor?
Yeah, well, so in terms of forced labor, I mean, when they introduced Vernichtung durch Arbeit, so extermination through labor, that's explicitly defined as being for Jews and Romany people, Zigeuner, right at the beginning. And indeed, so Romany people they get hold of are put through extermination through labor, brought into that. Equally well, in the 1940 deportation to bits of the three different parts of the general government from the Rhineland, a number of categories of people, of families, are exempted because they're going to deport as families. Families who've got people in the Wehrmacht are exempted. Families where the men are in permanent employment lasting longer than 5 years are also, no, so in that case, permanent employment are exempted. Later on, at the Auschwitz degree, if you've had 5 years permanent work, some people manage to get away, to stay in Germany. Because of that long-term work, because you could say this is evidence that we're not real gypsies. So work was absolutely central.
We're not real gypsies because of the fact that we are clearly sedentary for over 5 years.
So sedentary for much longer and have a regular work employment for more than 5 years. Yeah. I mean, the thing was it was totally arbitrary at that stage, almost totally arbitrary at that stage. an enormous amount came down to the attitudes of the local authorities. I mean, in this case, the welfare office are pretty clearly saying, look, let's just, let's feed these people. In another town, I'm absolutely sure one could find welfare officers saying, right, cut their rations, because now we know that they're only 75% Deutschblutig. So it's so you're right that there are central ordinances. Often, so after when the commentaries on the Nuremberg laws are issued, they say that, of course, the Zigeuner are also, from the point of view of blood, Artfremde, so of an alien sort, and these regulations apply to them. There are no Rassenschande cases of Romany families that we know of. Then it's not. On the other hand, towards the end of the war, people are regularly, couples are split up. In which the German partner is told, if you stay with your gypsy partner, you will go to a concentration camp. So there is a sort of central aspect to it. But you're absolutely right, the work is absolutely central. And then the irony, in a way, I mean, it's like beyond the scope of this talk, is that, for Eastern Europe, 5 years after the end of all this, once the communists are installed, work is again, the problem with these people is they're not really in proper work. We've got to make them proper Soviet, Hungarian citizens, force them back to proper work of the sort we think that those uneducated folks should do.
We've got time for one more question. Nick.
Thank you, Michael. I just was wondering, very much apropos of what you were just saying about the Roma that found themselves in Eastern Europe and under sort of Soviet domination. There was a big move in the early 2000s to sort of include the sort of decade of Roma inclusion work funded by the Open Society Foundations. The European Commission has taken up the leadership role on this. I was wondering how successful those efforts have been, in your view, how rooted in the historical experience. You were talking earlier about lack of compensation paid to people in Western Europe. Have those issues? There was a major focus on Eastern Europe at that time, in the early 2000s, and has that sort of did that forget what still needed to be done?
Not entirely. I mean, I don't even remember when the Swiss banks discovered gold deposits, which they'd forgotten about. A lot of those were distributed to Romany families, surviving Romany families in Eastern Europe, including in Hungary. Romany families from the west of Hungary have been taken, the men have been taken to Dachau and so on, and in Poland and so on. So there was it's a long story. The decade of Roma inclusion. I mean, there's an awful lot of Potemkin village stuff goes on in this area. So when Mr. George Soros announced that he was going to have a decade of Roma inclusion, and he was giving, I think, $100 million over 10 years. I mean, if you've got any understanding of how local government finance works, you know that $10 million a year across the whole of Europe it's a complete pittance. I mean, so there was a lot of noise made, and of course the European Union was very keen to say we're doing great things for the Romani minority. It's a trans-European minority. That said, what has happened through that whole period is the emergence of a trans-European Romani intelligentsia who go to Auschwitz and who write histories of their persecutions and so on. People with PhDs in many different countries. Navina is not here. I have a German master's student who's just completed her master's, or about to complete her master's, a German Romani student. So that a lot of that work has been supported really impressively by that European Union activity, more than on the ground, as it were, in terms of employment policies or segregated schooling and so on, which carry on rampantly.
Well, on that tiny little note of optimism, I am bringing this part of the evening to an end, but it's 7:30 and there is wine and cheese downstairs. For those who wish to continue the conversation, you are all most welcome. Thank you very much, and in the meanwhile, a huge round of applause for Michael Stewart.
Thank you, Misha.